students. In this class, let's discuss on the topic demand in detail. Consumer demand is the basis of all productive activities. Increasing demand for a product offers high business prospects for it in future, and decreasing demand for a product diminishes its business prospects. Thus, it becomes essential for business managers to have a clear understanding of demand. Now, what is demand? Ordinarily, by demand, we mean desire or want for something. In economics, however, demand means much more than that. In economics, demand refers to the desire accompanied by purchasing power. When we use the word purchasing power, it means the power to purchase goods and services, which is nothing but the money in hand. A person who desires to purchase a commodity should have ability to purchase it and willingness to spend on it. Demand may be defined as that want, need, or desire which is backed by willingness and ability to buy a particular commodity in a given period of time. Or we can say demand is the effective desire for a commodity which is backed up by purchasing power and willingness to pay for it. Obviously, to a businessman, a buyer's wish for the product without possessing money to buy it or not willing to give a price for it will not constitute a demand. Thus, in short, we can say demand is equal to the desire for a commodity plus ability to pay for the commodity plus willingness to spend for the commodity. That's what constitutes demand. So demand is not an absolute term. It is a relative concept. Demand for a commodity should always have a reference to price and time. Thus, the demand for a product refers to the amount of the product which will be bought per unit of time at a particular price. So the definition that is given by Professor Benham is like this. The demand for anything at a given price is the amount of it which will be bought per unit of time at that price. Now let's look into the difference between individual demand and market demand. So what is demand? Demand is a desire for a commodity backed by purchasing power. That is, the ability to pay for the commodity and the willingness to pay for the commodity. So now let's look into that individual demand and market demand. Individual demand refers to the demand for a commodity from the individual's point of view. The quantity of a product consumer would buy at a given price over a given period of time is his individual demand for that particular product. Individual demand is considered from either a person's point of view or that of a family or household's point of view. Now, what is market demand? Market demand for a product refers to the total demand of all the buyers taken together. Market demand is an aggregate of the quantities of the product demanded by the individual buyers at a given price over a given period of time. Market demand is more important from the business point of view because market demand constitutes the entire demand for a product at a given period of time, at a given price. Sales depend on the market demand. Business policy and planning are all based on the market demand. Prices are also determined on the basis of market demand for the product. In a competitive market, what determines the equilibrium price? It is the interaction of these two market forces, namely market demand and market price. So that determines the equilibrium price. Thus, market demand serves as an guidepost to producers in adjusting their supply in the market. Hence, we should always remember that from the business point of view, market demand gives always a better picture. Now, let's look into the various determinants of demand. Now, what do you mean by determinants of demand? Determinants of demand means what are the factors that determine the demand? What are the factors that influence demand? What makes the demand change? So let's look into the factors one by one. We all know the most important factor affecting demand is the price of the commodity. A consumer usually decides to buy looking into the price. A rise in the price of the commodity will usually contract the demand of that commodity and vice versa. And normally, remember, price has a negative effect on demand, which means higher the price, lower is the demand. Lower the price, higher is the demand. So they move into opposite directions. So we say price has a negative effect on demand. So that is one of the important factors that determine demand, namely price of the commodity. And the next is consumers' income. Consumers' income is yet another factor which influences demand. Normally, income has a positive effect on demand. When we use the word positive, it means there is a direct relationship between consumers' income and demand. That is, An increase in consumers' income leads to an increase in the demand of various commodities. And the next factor that determines demand is the consumer's tastes, habits, and preferences. Demand for many products depends on the person's tastes, habits, and preferences. For instance, demand for products like ice cream, chocolates, and so on depends on individuals' tastes. And similarly, there are items like products like coffee, tea, cigarettes, which actually is a matter of habits. And all this do not happen to be the same for all individuals. Different consumers have different tastes, habits, and preferences. So that is yet another factor that determines demand. Another factor is the prices of related goods. When we say related goods, it could be either substitutes or complementary goods, which means the demand for a commodity not only depends on the price of that particular commodity, but also on the price of other related commodities, such as a substitute or a complementary good. For example, in the case of substitutes like tea and coffee, a very common example that we take, what happens here? If we take the case of substitutes like tea and coffee, just try to understand. These are substitutes, tea and coffee. Why are they substitutes? Because they can be replaced for one another. Here you see that a rise in the price of coffee will increase the demand for tea, or a fall in the price of coffee will increase the demand for will decrease the demand for tea. I hope it is clear. Since they are substitutes, a rise in the price of one commodity will have its impact on the demand for another commodity, which is a substitute. Similarly, in the case of complementary goods, what are complementary goods? Those commodities which have to be consumed together. Now, for example, a good example of complementary goods is petrol and car. A car cannot be used without petrol. So, in this case, what happens? A rise in the price of petrol will lead to a reduction in the demand for car. I hope it is clear. When the price of petrol increases, it becomes difficult to actually manage a car because the price of petrol has increased. So what happens to the demand for car? The demand for car decreases. So we should remember, demand also depends upon the prices of related goods, which could be either a substitute or complementary goods. Yet another factor is consumers' expectations about the future changes in the prices of a given commodity, which also affect its demand. When a consumer expects the price to fall in future, what will the consumer do? The consumer will buy less at the prevailing price. Similarly, if the consumer expects the price to rise in future, he will intend to buy more at present. And the next factor is wealth. The amount demanded of a commodity is also affected by the amount of wealth as well as its distribution. When people are wealthy, what happens to the demand for normal goods? The demand for normal goods increases. And if the wealth is more equally distributed, the demand for necessaries and comforts also increase. So the demand also depends upon the wealth of the consumers. And next is the government policy. Government comes out with various policies that affects the demands for the commodities, especially through taxation and subsidization. Taxing a commodity increases its price and thereby the demand goes down. Similarly, when government provides subsidies, what happens to the price? Price falls, which leads to an increase in demand. And the next factor is the climatic conditions. The climate of an area and the weather prevailing there has a decisive effect on demand. For example, in cold areas, there is more demand for woolen clothes. During rainy season, there is more demand for raincoats and umbrellas. During summer, there is more demand for cold drinks and ice creams. So, demand also depends upon the climatic and weather conditions. And demand also depends upon business conditions. The level of demand for different commodities also depends upon the business conditions. If a country is passing through boom conditions, there will be a great increase in demand. When we use the word boom, boom refers to an economic conditions where all the economic variables, namely price, employment, production, everything will be at its top level. So when conditions are favorable, what happens to demand? Demand increases. On the other hand, the level of demand goes down during depressions. When the economic conditions are very bad, what happens to demand? Demand falls. Depression means very bad economic condition. And the next is availability of consumer credit. Availability of consumer credit, either from banks or other sources, encourages the consumers to buy more than what they could buy in the absence of credit facility. Today we see people are in a position to buy so many products, especially the durable products like, say, scooters, bikes, cars, because all these products are available on a credit basis. So it becomes easier for the consumers to buy these products, even if they do not have money at that particular point of time. And the next factor is advertisement. In modern days, the preferences of a consumer can be easily altered by advertisement and sales propaganda. There is no doubt about that. Advertisement plays a very important role in boosting or increasing the demand for a product. So, these are the determinants of demand. Next, we will look into the demand function. When we use the word function here, it is a mathematical word. It explains the functional relationship between the variables that determine demand. So, what is this demand function? The relationship between quantity demanded and various determinants is expressed algebraically in the form of a function, which we call it as a demand function. Now we have looked into the various determinants. Let's just take few of the determinants. If you go back to the previous one, you'll see the determinants. Maybe price of the commodity, consumer's income, consumer's taste, price of related goods, and so on. Now, if we have to express them by way of a demand function, how do we write? We say dx, that is demand for commodity X. Dx refers to demand for commodity X is equal to f of px, y, t, poc. What is px? It is the price of commodity X. What is y? Income of the consumer. What is t? Taste of the consumer. P is PO is price of other related goods. And C is climate. We can include any number of variables. So when we explain it in the form of a demand function, we very simply with this one line, we can actually analyze many things. dx, demand for commodity X, is a function of price of commodity X, that is Px, income of the consumer, that is Y, taste of the consumer, that is T, prices of other related goods, that is PO, C, that is the climate. So this is what we call as a demand function. So next, we go to the main law of demand. The law of demand expresses the relationship between the price of the commodity and the demand for it. The law of demand states the nature of relationship between the quantity demanded of a product and the price of the product. Remember here that law of demand expresses the relationship between only two variables. Which are the two variables? The price of the product and the quantity demanded of that product. So the law of demand states that other things remaining constant, or we can say other things being equal. If the price of a commodity falls, the quantity demanded of that commodity will extend. And if the price of the commodity rises, the quantity demanded contracts. Thus, the law of demand expresses this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. According to Alfred Marshall, greater the amount to be sold, the smaller must be the price at which it is offered in order that it may find purchasers. Or we can say the amount demanded increases with the fall in price and diminishes with the rise in price. So, in simple, what does the law of demand tell us? Other things remaining constant, higher the price, lower is the demand. Lower the price, higher is the demand. Now, what are these other things? We have explained this already in the determinants. Remember, demand depends not only on price but on various other factors. But the law of demand takes only law of demand expresses the relationship between only two variables, namely demand and price. Okay, that's why we say other things being equal, or we say other things remaining constant, or other things remaining as they are. What happens? Higher the price, lower the demand. Lower the price, higher is the demand. So here, how will the demand function be? So here the demand function shows relationship between two variables. So we write it as D is equal to F of P, which means demand is a function of price. It is expressed as D is equal to F of P. Demand depends upon price. There is an inverse relationship. Higher the price, lower the demand. Lower the price, higher is the demand. Remember here, D is the dependent variable, P is an independent variable. Why is P an independent variable? Because P changes first, due to which demand also changes. In what way do they change? They have an inverse relationship. So that's what the law of demand states. Here also, every law in economics goes by assumptions. There is not a single law in economics which is explained without assumptions, because it is all subject to, all the laws in economics are subject to human behavior. All economic laws are conditional. So we have to make a list of assumptions on which the law is based. So what are the assumptions? So the assumptions of the law of demand are: there is no change in consumers' income. Here we assume that consumers' income remains constant. So the assumption is that there is no change in consumers' income. There is no change in the taste and preference of the consumer. The price of related commodities remain constant. And we also assume that the goods in question are all normal goods. It should not be a prestige goods. And we also assume there is no change in the wealth of the consumers. Sorry, there is a little error in the slide. It should be no change in the wealth of the consumer. And the next one is that there are no new substitutes for the product. Price is not expected to change in near future. There is no change in government policy. There is no change in weather conditions. So these are the assumptions that are made before explaining the law of demand. Now, what are the features of the law of demand? So, we have a few important features that need to be highlighted in the case of the law of demand. The first one is the law of demand expresses an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And the next feature is that in this demand function, namely D is equal to F of P, price is a dependent variable and demand is an independent variable. And the third feature is ceteris paribus. That is, other things remain constant. So there are a little errors here. Price is an independent variable. There is a typing error here. Please note down, students. It is price is an independent variable. independent, independent variable, and demand is a dependent variable. dependent. Okay. So please note down the error here. So if you're writing down, please be careful. Write it as price is an independent variable. It is one word, independent variable, and demand is a dependent variable because demand depends upon price. Higher the price, lower the demand. Lower the price, higher the demand. So what changes first? It is the price which changes first. So we call price as independent variable. Because of that change in price, it has an impact on demand. So we call demand as a dependent variable. So these are the important features. One, inverse relationship. Price is an independent variable. Demand is a dependent variable. And the next is, we always use the word ceteris paribus, which means other things remaining constant while explaining the law of demand. So with this, we finish a part of the law of demand. In the next class, let's look into the illustration of the law of demand with the help of a demand schedule and a demand curve which can be drawn graphically. So the next class, we will look into the law of demand and its illustration. Thank you.